This is
Podcast Raleigh
with your hosts,
Ashton and Hayes.
It's needed so that democracy can survive through generations. We don't want to poison the appetite for a healthy democracy. And I think if we don't lead with a different leadership style, I think we may, if you go out and you talk to people, they're not rah-rahing for democracy like you were here before. But I think if it's done well with healthy leadership, it's a wonderful governance tool.
Welcome into Podcast Raleigh. In this episode, we talk to Terrance Ruth, a career educator, but also a self-described student of the community. We talk about policy and politics, where the two align and also where they don't. And we also talk about his podcast on this podcast, because that's podcasting. Terrance Ruth has been a public school teacher and administrator, a college professor, a policy evaluator, a foundation founder, and yes, a mayoral candidate, which, though it might be how you know of him, is clearly not how he would primarily define himself. We talk about his journey in education and his connection to community, as well as his current podcast, which you can find at his website, truth4raleigh.com. That's truth, the number 4, Raleigh.com. But of course, we started by asking Terrance Ruth how he ended up in Raleigh.
My very early history, the history I don't remember, is my great-great-grandmother. She was raised in this area, and then when she became an adult and she had kids, she had my grandmother. She actually went to day labor up in New Jersey.
Okay.
That's how my memory exited Raleigh very early. We still have a home in Cary, and I have a family member who is in her 80s in Cary.
Okay.
But that's sort of like the core memory of like the origin story. But my parents were in the military, and we moved all over the United States. I was born on a military base, and my father was stationed in the Orlando military base, which is no longer there. And so I was in Central Florida for a good while. When I left for college, came back, I got a job. The job was building alternative schools in juvenile detention centers.
Oh, wow.
And so George W. was the president at the time, and we were building, and he moved forward with an initiative to have education programs be preventative rather than just catching those who. And so we started to see these alternative schools leave the juvenile justice corps and enter public schools. Wake County hired that company. That company had me come to North Carolina. And so we first started at Heritage High School. We was in Heritage High School. Principal Savage, he's now superintendent. And then they moved us to Longview in Southeast Raleigh.
Oh, wow.
And so my relationship with the city started with alternative students in Southeast Raleigh on North King Charles Road.
Now,
Longview High School.
Did you expect it to be a permanent move, or were you kind of being temporarily relocated to set things up and then just stuck around?
It was positioned as permanent. It's funny when people talk about Raleigh growing. When I arrived, it was like 2009, 2010. It was growing. Everybody was talking about all the stats and
Convention centers just reopened, Fable Street's reopened. Yeah,
talking about growth and the predictions. So the same stuff you hear today.
Yep.
But it's amazing how everyone talk as if it was like the last 2 or 3 years, but actually it's been growing for some time. And so that was my relationship. Little school, we had less than 100 kids. It's a rolling membership. I will never be principal of the year, not in alternative schools. We don't get any visitors. We don't go on field trips. This school is really to help re-engage kids who felt disconnected from their, and we would call it base school. And so that was my relationship. That was the beginning, taking kids home in Southeast Raleigh and connecting with parents. And so that was my beginning.
All right, just to clarify, so you had a family connection to Raleigh.
Yes.
Had you ever been here before the job moved you here?
Only for family trips.
Okay.
But I was so young, I couldn't even tell you. They tell me what I was doing.
Right. But at least when you got moved here, you were like, oh, that's that place.
Well, actually, I heard of that place from my father. My father grew up in Southern Pines. And he came to Raleigh, like he was a caddy. He grew up, that's back when you can caddy and make money. So he was making more money than his parents. And he moved away for better work, and it was Raleigh. Raleigh was the big city, he said. It was funny when I was moving here. I said, "Dad, I'm moving to the big, I'm moving to the big city."
Sure.
But he talked more about Raleigh than my mother or my mother's side actually talked about Raleigh.
So when you first moved here, I'm imagining you're hearing all of this growth, you're seeing sort of the success that Raleigh's having, but your day-to-day work life is in working with kids who are not experiencing that same level of success and growth. What was that like for you, kind of trying to balance that dichotomy?
Yeah, so what was fascinating about that whole narrative is that I sort of was embedded in the growing pains of Raleigh rather than the benefits of it. Most of my work was, so I didn't see any of the flash, but I felt that if we zoomed into the lives of these young kids and their families, there's something magical about these kids. One student, his brother's now at Morehouse College. I've seen his whole family grow. I've seen his whole family. I mean, the older brother had some troubles. He ended up getting through high school, but now his brother was like president of Enloe, and like he's at Morehouse, and he's a freshman. I just went to the Marbles Imagination Ball, and he was there talking on the mic. I mean, it was just. I mean, there's some stories in the pain moments of growth that I think it's worth uplifting and celebrating, and I think we overlook that for the more glamour side of growth.
The Convention and Visitors Bureau doesn't highlight those stories the same way.
Yes. I think it's a good way to show the story of Raleigh through the stories of those who have made it through more of the growing pains than those who are either benefiting from the years of growth, just newly arriving. There's some people who've been here. There's stories, their grandparents.
Yeah.
I met one former president of St. Aug, and he talked about his grandparents making the stones that make the bricks of the buildings at St. Aug.
Cool.
And so if you don't take time to zoom into those stories, you miss sort of a long history of people who have lived in the shadows of growth. But their stories is, if not more fascinating than what you would read in any magazine.
We're going to talk about your podcast later, but I can see why you're into podcasts. That's good. Yeah.
You got a PhD in public affairs. Was the goal to get into school teaching and specifically alternative school, or were there just events that led you to end up in that position?
Yeah, I'm going to be honest with you. I entered into the workforce as an educator. I was in Atlanta. I was at a school called Oglethorpe University, and I had a professor named she was Dr. King at the moment. She's now Dr. Moman. She's now president of Oglethorpe, but she just said, "Hey, I'm gonna invest in you," and she started to allow me to meet different leaders. So I got a chance to meet the late John Lewis and Coretta Scott, and I mean, just amazing legends in so the civil rights story. And when I left there, I said, I'm gonna go be an educator. And I went to get a job in Tampa, Florida. I couldn't tell you what the job description was. I just was excited. And when I arrived, the kids were marching in uniforms. And then they were saying a cadence, almost like a railroad changing. And it was an awkward moment because you don't ever see schools like that. Right. You don't ever see kids in sort of jumpsuit uniforms. And I ended up loving the job. I took the job, and I would stay late and play basketball with the kids. It was a residential facility. So when I would come as a teacher, I would wake them up out of their bunk, time them in the shower, take them to go eat breakfast, and then I'll start teaching. I loved it. I wasn't going to leave from that moment. Then I started to see patterns. I was like, why am I seeing the same families? Why am I seeing the same demographic, the same profile? That's what started my learning journey. That's when I went to go get my master's in education. And I realized that it's a much larger sort of trend than my local school. Then I went to go get my PhD. My PhD is in global studies. And so you look at poverty at a global stage and trends. So even my dissertation is on poverty at a global stage. But some of the trends are familiar even if you zoom into local. So what drove me to my PhD was really trying to understand my students. I couldn't understand why society was producing this outcome or this output, however you would like to see it. And that sparked my curiosity. Because I was like, it can't be, is it the chicken or the egg? I couldn't understand that pattern. That's what actually brought me through that journey of higher education and learning.
It sounds like the first school you ever worked at was, I don't know, I won't get the exact term right, but some sort of alternative. Do you think if that first job had been, again, I'm not using the right terms, a regular high school,
That's right.
do you think you might have just stayed in that path? But once you saw this side, it really piqued your curiosity to learn more, like I said, about the kids and the bigger picture?
That's a really good question. Well, as a child, my parents always had us in community. We were always leaning into areas of homelessness. And so that was a norm, default disposition of mine. So when I walked into that alternative school, I felt comfortable. I felt excited. But I think a traditional school or any other job, I don't think I would have landed where I'm at. I always considered myself a student. And I was a student to these students. They were telling me things I've never even heard of. They were giving me glimpses and gaps in our system and structures that I wouldn't have read in a book, still haven't read in a book, And so there's a moment to be a student, and I always try to lean into that position. And I've learned a lot. And if I didn't learn from that class, I was the student, they were the teachers. I don't think I would have been the Terrance I am today, to be honest with you.
And so when you came to Raleigh, how long did you stay associated with that school? And then what was your next move after that?
And so for probably about 6 or 7 years. So while working at that school, I finished my PhD and I wanted to use it. This is a very tough market for PhD because everyone has a PhD. So,
I've never really thought about it that way, but I suppose you're probably right. Yeah.
Very tough market. So I applied at the Friday Institute, and Tripp Stallings and Jenny Korn, they're very well known in the policy evaluation world. They evaluate education policy. They're still doing it right now at DPI. Amazing human beings. Dr. Tricia Townsend, I got to mention her as well. They took me under their wings as a young PhD and taught me how to evaluate policy. And I was still principal. Very rarely do you get someone who has practical experience and sort of higher ed academic experience. Usually it's one or the other. I had a combination, and they were excited about that combination. And so I got a chance to evaluate race to the top, got a chance to hear from traditional schools, charter schools, private homeschool. I really zoomed out to the state. And that's really what allowed for me to sort of see the world and see North Carolina was when I got that job. Then I was traveling all over. I took the job for the NAACP. I became executive director right after that job.
Okay.
And I was working under Dr. Barber, Dr. Spearman. And then I had to travel and learn sort of the grassroots of North Carolina. And they had a chapter in every county. So you're talking about moving all over. And then I really got a chance to meet
Did you make it all 100 counties?
Yeah.
Wow.
We got a chance to literally meet North Carolina at that point. Before that, was all urban, all nice and neat, Wake County. Outside of that, it's a different universe. Like it's a different East, West. It's a different universe. So I got a chance to really meet North Carolina through those particular career opportunities.
So it feels like between your experience and your PhD, you should have the answers to how we solve poverty and education.
It's crazy. It used to be, especially in Ann McCall, I'm gonna give her credit. Ann McCall is an attorney who teaches the history of the creation of the black school system. And what you find in that story is that learning was really pretty much owned at the home. So it was a church pastor, was also the teacher. And so that's why you have a lot of the early black schools are in churches. But prior to that, learning was home. Yeah. There was an element of autonomy, of owning your mind at home. And I think there's something valuable about that. And I think there's something we can learn from that, even in how we see education now.
Yeah, wow, thanks.
You talked about learning to evaluate policy. That sounds like we could do, a 10-part podcast
Right,
and not even touch it.
I don't want to totally derail us, but I have a lot of questions.
I do find it, I guess there it was specifically evaluating educational policy, but I do find it curious, and we'll get to your podcast, like you said, it sounds like that's some of what you're doing there is like evaluating local policy on some of these things and talking to people. So can you give me a 2-minute answer on what evaluating a policy looks like? It seems like it would take years to be like, okay, this policy was enacted here. What are the results 10 years later? What goes into evaluating a policy?
You're right about years. And it's a team. It's a team of about 10 to 15 people. Could be larger or smaller. And they are hired at the same time that the bill is enacted. Sometimes they're hired prior to. It was wonderful to get what the ground looks like prior to planting the seeds. And so they walk through and they set up the structures by which you will capture and measure the data. And then they just give input to the legislature. But more importantly, they write reports for the average person. And they just share out. And it's both quantitative and qualitative. So they're doing one-on-one interviews, or they're just taking just sort of test scores or whatever that may be. The reason why I think policy evaluation is critical is because it's one thing if it's just an experiment. So I'm at NC State. I do experiments all the time. It's another thing when the taxpayers are paying for this experiment. And it's another thing. It's another thing when, somebody's job is putting
well, and if it's
dollars
an experiment,
to work.
we should have some metrics as to whether it's successful or not.
Yes, and oftentimes we have a great environment where we campaign for the intention behind a policy and not necessarily the outcome of a policy. And so people live off of intentions. They live their campaign career off of intentions. I love your intentions, but do people have homes right now?
Right,
Are people getting jobs at the moment? Are we reducing crime? Are we increasing safety? At the end of the day, I would love to be able to answer those questions. And it does take a team that sits outside of the political infrastructure. So our team wasn't connected to, and there was one at UNC as well. So there's different teams. RTI is probably the most famous one. But they just evaluate programs, policies, initiatives. They even allow you to do a need assessment to say, would this even be important to do? Like, should we even waste dollars on doing this particular task? So that was my journey into sort of like real life policy creation, successful policy. Sometimes it's not about money. There's no correlation between how much money went into this policy and how successful it is. We've seen millions of dollars go into
so
a
you
policy.
definitely want to find that out. Like, let's not spend money on things that aren't doing anything.
Millions of dollars into a policy, and it literally, after years of evaluation, didn't end well. But what really was, I think, is most important, even after intention. Intention is amazing, but how you implement that policy. And I think in order to implement a policy well, you have to be able to have an audience with the people who will be impacted by the policy. If they are an afterthought and only the smart people in the room are creating and designing, I think you miss the implementation. Even if your intentions are well, you want to end whatever that issue may be. If you can't implement it, if you can't translate that to the human beings that will actually determine if it's successful or not, I think you have a gap in that space.
Yeah.
Real quick house cleaning. You said DPI. We're an acronym-free podcast. Everyone knows. DPI, I think I got, Department of Public Instruction.
That's it.
What's RTI?
RTI, what is RTI?
Research Triangle Institute?
Thank you.
Okay.
Is that it?
Thank you. Yes.
I'm not sure. That feels right, but I don't know.
I know.
People never say the name of RTI. So
I think it's one of those entities that might not even be anything but letters now.
Yes,
like at some
yes,
point they were a whole
yes.
name and then they just condensed.
Yes.
Well, I talked to somebody recently. It was related to autism, but the language around how they use autism has changed. So that when they created the group, now they don't say it the same way now. So they use the acronym because they don't want to didn't want to fade the brand, but they're like, well, it's kind of we've kind of updated our language, so let's just use the acronym anyway.
Yeah.
But
DHIC is another one. They used to be a whole name, and now they're just an acronym.
we just like to, I've heard state employees credit union commercials.
Oh,
now
yes,
they're not even saying CQ, but they are saying SECU.
Okay.
So anyway, we just like to let people know what was behind the acronym.
No, that's
point.
good.
So,
That's
sorry,
good.
I cut you off.
No. I was just thinking about what you were saying and how the ability to talk to people who are going to be the subjects of a policy or things like that is so important, but also how that makes policy and programs so hard to scale.
That's right.
Because when you can do the conversations and that kind of stuff locally, you can see a lot of success. And when you evaluate a policy, someone then comes in and says, let's dump a ton of money into
That's
it.
right.
And it doesn't ever have the same kinds of effects. So
That's right.
just an interesting thing of how do you balance the need for input when you get to larger scales. But
No, that's good. And I think we are entering a phase in the world where capturing data can be much easier than it used to be.
Sure.
But we also have actors on that side, and you don't want to unleash data collection on people and not have accountability at that sense.
Sure,
so,
privacy and all of
And I
that,
know
but,
government
yeah.
is behind in terms of accountability on that end. So, But I do think we're getting to a point where we can capture data at a more efficient pace.
Yeah, now we just have to figure out what to do with it.
Yes, yes.
All right, so you're in this role for a little while, and then now you are teaching. What happens in the middle space?
Yeah, so after the NAACP, what I've realized is that there are communities who are suffering. So the NAACP sits neatly in an advocacy space. They're normally and it's saturated with attorneys fighting for people across a range of issues. Most people just look at headlines, but really they're touching a range of issues. But I realize that there is a need for support in the current now moment status of human beings' lives. And I was hired by Christopher Gergen in Forward Cities out in Durham. And Christopher Gergen is a professor at Duke University. He wrote several books. He started this thing. He connected me with she was a VP at the time. She's now the CEO, Faye Horwick. And if you don't know Faye Horwick, her mind is just brilliant. If you give her a marker and a whiteboard, she can solve world hunger. So she is
Somebody give her a marker already.
Biggest whiteboard you can have, whatever you need.
But they created an organization where we would go across the country and create entrepreneurial ecosystem for Black and brown communities. And they had me everywhere, from Kansas City to Indianapolis to Ohio to Pittsburgh to New Kensington. And it was fascinating. I'd never been on the entrepreneurial side of the world. I've always been on the educating, informed advocacy space. And I seen an audience empowered with this information. And it really sort of opened up my eyes to possibilities of not just celebrating Black Wall Street. You got a lot of people celebrate Black Wall Street or the Harlem Renaissance. You can birth that creativity now. It's still here. The genes are still running through these individuals' bodies. And so Christopher Gergen and that model, and they were funded by I think either Kellogg's or I can't remember the funding institution. And it still exists today. I
was going to ask, yeah.
It still exists today.
Haven't heard from them in a while, but they do great work.
Yeah, they're helping municipalities at the moment, but and it's just amazing work. And that opened up my eyes. And then so I came back and started the Justice Love Foundation. And the Justice Love Foundation was created in response to my experience with the Poor People's Campaign. We had everyone go to D.C., I think it was 2017 or 16, and it was recreating that Poor People's Campaign with MLK. And I realized that the poverty I'm seeing in the Triangle or in Raleigh is literally across the United States, literally from all across, north, south. And I said, in these organizations of advocacy, really it's the mid-level worker or the low-level worker that's doing a bunch of the work. And when you're in that space around advocacy, normally they're advocating out of need. So if they're advocating for hunger, that's because they're hungry. If they're advocating because of flooding, that's because their house is flooded. They don't have the luxury of just advocating on somebody else's behalf. And so the Justice Love Foundation was a strategy to try to get money directly to those individuals at mid-level or low-level sort of social justice advocacy organizations.
Okay.
So that we can sustain their life and their way of life so that they can sustain their community. They was sort of trying to find the rock stars.
Okay, so you mean the individuals, not the organizations necessarily.
Yeah, we were individual focused.
Okay.
So we can come alongside major foundations and institutions and say, just give us support. We can find the rock star and fund them so that it could sustain the work. And it was amazing. We were supported by several organizations, but United Way ended up taking that charge.
Okay.
And United Way, in 2020, 2021, we took 10 young community leaders and we walked them through design thinking for a whole year, and then we seed invested their idea for their community. And the MLK, every year there's an MLK breakfast with United Way and WRAL, and they presented their idea to the Triangle. And the theory of change was if we normalize design thinking and solution creation in community, then we allow for that community to become more autonomous or independent around what's needed and reimagine their mind as being the center of solution creation rather than relying on any other entity. And so that still is going on today. Now they're working with Leadership Triangle
Is that 10 to Watch, or is that a different program?
This is a different
Okay.
program. And so this is with Christian Sloan, did a whole year with that same group and sort of gave them leadership development. What does it mean to take an idea that you created and with seed invested and make it an organization? What does it mean to create a budget? Some of those sort of fundamental things that when you're in raw community and you're advocating, your needs is at the primary forefront of your mind. Now to take that idea so it can serve others, you have to formalize that process. And so Christine did an amazing job walking them through that journey. So then after that, focused in on NC State, was able to work with African Studies, teach African American leadership, and then also teach research evaluation for the School of Social Work.
You used to teach high school kids at alternative schools. What's different about teaching college kids? And what's the same?
No, that's
What's
good.
universal about teaching?
It felt like to me that the weight of having to be at school hindered the excitement and innovation that could potentially be in a high school environment. In a college campus, they're picking their professors, they're picking their topic. There's some level of energy, and I teach master's level students. So there's some level of energy, and there's an awareness that you are buying this. You are. That allows for us to reach some level within the text that you probably couldn't reach in high school. Now, there's some amazing high school leaders who would run circles around college students and probably not even thinking about college. And before he went to college, Kerwin Pittman was one. Greer Webb. Greer Webb, before he even went to college, I thought he was 35. Before he even went to college, I thought he was just. And now he's at Emory in Atlanta. But there's some high school students that are really impressive. District
Podcast
C,
Raleigh guest.
You'll pat yourself in the back. Former guest on the podcast.
But no, I think we saw the same things you
Yes,
did. Of like,
yes.
it matched our. We try to reach all levels, all different types of people, and we're like, we haven't had many young people on.
Yes.
This guy's a great person to represent young people right now.
He's awesome. And what I like about Greer is that he also feeds younger audience. And what we've seen, especially in the advocacy space, we've seen it very difficult to transfer leadership across generations. So you see Greer, and then you got to wait a long time. Then you get to those who are leading now.
Yeah.
So there's a gap in between, and I think Greer is a healthy hope for being able to transfer leadership across generations.
So I think thinking about that then, knowing you decided to start a podcast, is that part of the decision, is to help empower and fix that gap of leadership?
Yeah, I think leadership framed in a healthy way helps all people.
Yeah.
That's why I started the podcast with Ella Baker. Ella Baker, there's no statue, there's no big book, there's no, but she is a giant, and her framework around leadership is critical. But at the time, she was competing with MLK's framework of leadership. She was competing with a very traditional hierarchy. So if you go into the NAACP sort of background, I mean, it's very hierarchical. Everybody has their role. There's bylaws that's heavily embedded in positions. Ella was like, we need to decentralize leadership.
Okay.
She said we need strong people, and strong people, you don't need a strong leader. And so Ella was really spearheading this leadership model that we will embrace today, with no question.
Yeah.
But at the time, no one was, and she didn't want any credit. She did a lot of work. She didn't want any credit. I think a healthy leadership in that way, a leader that you're not looking to rescue or save or be all-knowing, I think that's a healthy leadership for a community. Because now it's not about me having all answers. It's about the community being able to populate individuals at random with solutions. So she had a team of college students that changed America in a basement. So imagine if communities had basements where you're able to, bubble up these ideas. That really
Good ideas
change
can come from
America.
anywhere.
Yeah.
You just have to have the framework to support them.
I think that's sustainable. I think it's healthy. And so the podcast rests on that framework.
Okay.
So we sort of rested on that framework. But the original idea behind the podcast was to try to get people to understand there already existing right now power that's embedded in local government. Like, you don't need to, get a PhD.
Yeah.
You don't need anything. You right now already have what's sufficient.
A voice and a
to
vote.
lead. Yes, you have it. And I think when I was sort of on the campaign trail, I didn't hear that. I didn't hear that at all. I heard communities waiting for growth to happen to them, or waiting for growing pains to happen to them. I didn't hear an empowered audience. And so I end up educating often in my speeches rather than, just talking on issues. I end up educating on how powerful you are right now. So I think that's a more sustainable, healthy, and it's needed so that democracy can survive through generations. We don't want to poison the appetite for a healthy democracy. And I think if we don't lead with a different leadership style, I think we may, if you go out and you talk to people, they're not rah-rahing for democracy like you would hear before. But I think if it's done well with healthy leadership, it's a wonderful governance tool. And so that's what the podcast was sort of resting on.
And built on the foundation of Ella Baker, what other topics have you covered? And I guess what would you like to cover that you haven't yet?
Yeah, we've touched a little bit of everything. We started out with Ella Baker because we wanted to show how many of the things we celebrate as a federal victory, like sit-ins, integrating schools, they started local. Those are local battles that bubbled up to the federal level. And so that's why we actually ended up starting with Ella. Ella showed you that really it's local government that's important. And you need to activate at that space, and you can influence larger spaces. So we've had everyone from architects to the terms to help people understand the difference between an architect and a developer. What's the framework of an architect? How would they want to hear from people? We talked to we have a city manager, a county manager coming on to the podcast. We talked to the legendary Dr. Dudley Flood, who helped integrate the schools in North Carolina. He had Ann McCall with him, and we talked about how that integration process outside of the federal policy was actually a local strategy to actually go into communities and find community leaders. We've talked to presidents of HBCUs and shown how that was very much a generational, local, sort of historical narrative. We've talked on a little bit of everything. I would love to go into the crevices of how a city runs and look at positions that nobody will ever hear of. Like, who's behind the budget? Like how does that engine runs so that people won't feel intimidated to participate? So you can have a participatory budget, but if it's intimidating, I'm not coming.
Sure, and if you don't know what all of those words mean or how that all plays out, or we see one giant category that says transportation, and you don't realize there's so many subsets to that. But
The only thing I would say is the podcast plug is illogical by truth, right?
Yes.
Do you say truth or do you say T? I'm going to ask you about the branding a little bit. But do you say illogical by truth?
By truth. It is truth. It is truth, yes.
Let's do that. Your name is Terrance Ruth.
Yes.
You use truth for a lot of branding. Was that an accident? Do you think your parents named you? Like, we got this last name Ruth. If we get my first name T. Or if not, if they weren't planning it, when did you come across of like, I should use this?
I'm going to be honest. I gave my mom a hard time. I was like, why did you think of Terrance? Like, all the things. And she was like, it's going to be special. You're going to like it one day. And NC State, my email is truth@ncsu.edu.
wow.
That's my.
They gave it to you. Right?
They haven't tried to buy that back from you or something?
That's actually my NC State
Mine
email.
was so boring. It was A. Smith,
My sister's, you'll have to finish the conclusion. Her first college email used the same construction. First letter, last name.
Yes.
Her name is Sally. Our last name is Permar. So it was that at davidson.edu. It's the first email address you ever had. I was like, so sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But let's stay with that. So, you use truth as a branding thing now. Like you own it. Is that why is that?
Yeah. So we knew we had my wife, my son, and we had people who were thinking about what does it mean for me to understand myself as a leader. And when you enter a campaign, people like strip you down and want to know your story. They want to know who you are. And so
in 15 seconds.
In 15 seconds. And so we started to think through values that are important to me. And at the time, people were sort of distrusting government. Things weren't transparent. We were coming out of a COVID crisis, and truth was actually a concept that was debated. Now it was a fight as to what is truth and what is not truth. And so we wanted to be bold in that way. We wanted to say that in this leadership model, in this campaign, in this human being, we're going to try to be as truthful as possible, try to be as transparent as possible, and try to be as trustworthy as possible in an environment where that's not the norm. And that's the new sort of offering we was going to give during the campaign. So our goal was to focus exclusively on issues. Our goal was to be as present as possible. Part of being trustworthy is to be in people's pain. It's one thing to have a great, wonderful policy I'm introducing with money going out. That's an easy day. A harder day is when somebody's crying or upset or frustrated. If you can be with them in that moment, you're building trust so that when it's time to be truthful, they can hear it. But in the absence of that, it's very difficult to be transparent or to be seen as transparent. Yeah. And so we just wanted to lean in that leadership model. We wanted to make sure that as a human being, myself, as a candidate, as a family, because we ran as a family, that we will be present as much as possible so that people can see who we are, so that people can see a human being, and so that we can be as trustworthy as possible in this process, which is not known for being that.
And let's talk some more about that. What led you to run for mayor? What was the experience like? What'd you learn from it? And let me start by, I commend anyone who steps up and runs for public office. It's a thankless task, and so we need more good people doing it, so I commend you for doing it. But what led to you to do it, and what was the experience like?
Yeah, so I had a different approach to answering that question in real time. At the moment, it was COVID, and everyone was virtual, and I started to receive calls from the community. At the time, our city looked a lot different. There was riots downtown. There was discussions around policing. I think a police accountability board was created. I mean, you're talking about a very intense lack of trust. Trust is on the ground. And there was a request from the community for someone who had the experience around policy. Literally, that's my PhD, but also had the experience in community. Like, I literally have been in Southeast Raleigh as a principal. I've been in NAACP. I've been in Forward Cities. My experience is in raw community where people's pains, fears, hopes rest. And so I answered that call. And in that process, I began to hold virtual meetings with community leaders. Am I the person that represents your desires from this city? And we've even held an unhoused event where we partnered with Johnny's Pizza. And we sat out and I talked to the unhoused. I said, what would you want from the city? And we had to build their trust immediately because they weren't used to people asking that question.
Sure.
But we took our approach differently. It was calls, then we did our part of seeing if that call was valid. And once we heard that the community want us to represent them, then we made the announcement in January 4th, the same week that you had the riot in D.C. And so that's when the campaign really hits. When you start to realize the shift in the tone of America and politics. And so your task of being trustworthy is much harder in a season like that than it would be in a traditional season.
I'm reflecting on kind of what you said about getting the calls and then taking the time to validate them, bringing that design thinking perspective to it. Because having run myself and talked to a lot of people over the years who have either been interested in running or et cetera, a lot of people skip that step.
Yeah.
People tell them, you should run, you should do it, and they forget to validate because it feels good.
That's it.
It feels really good to have people say that to you. So I commend you and your family for taking that time to have the internal and the external conversations about, is this the right move and the right time? And I can't even imagine what running in that time of history and locally and nationally was like, just trying to find that trust and get ahead of, but also through some of the noise at a national level.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, and I'm glad that you said that because most people don't understand the weight, the pressure that people place on you without even going to the community.
Yeah.
So you can validate, you're in your own mind because there's a huge weight and pressure to But I knew that I had a certain unique skill. And if the moment was right for that skill set, I will step up to the plate. If it was not, then I'm continuing my life of engaging community. And that's what I wanted to answer. I don't care for a billboard. I don't care for, I really want to make sure that my leadership is reflective of the people I valued in history. And they will go to the community first. If you remember the story of Dr. King, he was pushed to leadership. He wasn't raising his hand in the front row, and they said, no, we think you should do this. He was reluctant. He wasn't just standing in the front. Yeah, I could do this.
Yeah.
Even throughout his leadership journey, he went back and said, man, am I the person for it? You had your young John Lewis at the time, and so he was like, am I still the person for the job? Ella had to go and convince him sometimes. Yeah. So there's a human side to that that's real. And so thank you for.
And how do you think, so looking at the way politics are nationally and also locally, I think it's so often people aren't pushed into that space. It's instead the people who are seeking that spotlight. How do you think in your work, and whether that's the podcast or in the community, we collectively can find more opportunities to push people who are ready to be servant leaders forward? How do we do better at that?
Yeah, you know what's, I love that question, because usually when I'm given a young leader, they're excited because maybe they have a very articulate skill, or maybe they understand deep concepts earlier than other people. But a friend of mine, when I was learning how to be a leader, he gave me his life mission statement. And this mission statement went to his kids, went to his friends, and I followed that. So I have a mission statement. I have values. That's how I organize how I will make a decision.
Sure.
And it's more linear. Sort of. I got a weekly organizing process. There's a value structure which I go by. I give it to my friends and say, is this me, or am I trying to sound like I'm special? And it's a hard process because people are carving away at you, but they're doing it to help you. I think there's something healthy about that process.
Okay.
Before you are in a position of leadership. If you don't know who you are to the point where you have been carved down to like, this is me, this is my mission, this is my statement. When you get into a campaign, they're going to make that. They're going to make that person.
Yeah.
And so for me, I already had that carved down. I didn't need for anyone to say, oh, we can make you that. I'm good. I know exactly where I want to go. And so I think there's some work to be done prior to entering that decision that I think most people don't even engage in.
Yeah.
I've listened to, I've participated in, I've taken 1 billion leadership classes. No one has ever given me their personal mission statement. They give me their organizational, they give me their club mission statement, but like, who are you? Why are you on this earth? What do you plan to leave? And I don't think most people answer that question before they enter leadership in a formal structure. And I think that helps ground you when decisions are difficult or when there's no good decision.
Sure. Yeah, when you have to choose between two bad decisions,
yes.
Which one is closer to my mission and my values? And
that's right.
Yeah. So when you ran, what surprised you the most during your campaign?
I think what surprised me the most is how much people are passionate about their community. Now, you hear it in like zoning battles, but you don't get to hear it from people who don't have a home. Like, you don't get to hear it from, people who aren't old enough to vote. Like, you don't get to hear it from like certain audiences. But I remember being in a community that was going to be demolished. It was like an eviction party, that's what they called it, and for new development. It had the water sprinkler going back and forth. It looked like a cookout. I mean, it had the music was playing. They were line dancing. It was an amazing experience. And there was an older woman took my hands in the middle, and she said, "I trust you. Don't leave me." Now, the weight of campaign happens when you announce. Like, you get the weight of it. Everybody's sort of like, you can't like change your mind.
All the phone calls, all the things.
Yeah. But that was when the campaign started, that moment.
Yeah.
And that surprised me, like the weight that people carry and they transfer it to these moments. And so that's what surprised me.
I thought about this as a almost like an intro question, but now it almost serves better near the end. We've heard about all these different. You've taught at alternative schools. You've been a principal. You've been college. You taught college classes. Run the NAACP. You talked about all the leadership. You've been a mayoral candidate. And I say this as somebody who, like, people ask me what do you do, and I'm like, I don't know what to answer now. Sometimes I call baseball games. Sometimes I do a podcast. How do you answer the question? Like, if I say, hey, what do you do?
Yeah, no, that's actually a good question. I always consider myself a student of the community. And the reason why I say that, outside of just being a professor, because sometimes being a student may mean I may need to fight for affordable housing. Sometimes as a student, I may need to fight for hunger. Right now we have an adoption crisis. We have a saturated Wake County that's begging for parents because we don't have enough. We only have 100 or so parents. We have 500 kids that need homes. It was so bad at one point where some of the kids were sleeping in the offices. So we have some very difficult times ahead. And if you're a student to the community, then that's your job for the day. that's your job for that season. So I try to be as much of a student to the community as possible. I don't take myself too serious. When I entered the affordable housing world, I started asking questions, and I've just learned. And so we're hosting a affordable housing event later this year from just what I've learned. I've had some scrapes and bruises. I thought was a good idea, wasn't a good idea. I've learned from that, and we've been able to form that together.
Who's the we, if you don't mind me asking?
Neighbor to Neighbor,
okay.
And Church on Morgan, Lorena McDowell, Wake County Affordable Housing Department. She's amazing. She was on my podcast as well. We've been at this for like 3 years, and we've been trying to sort of crack this code. And so we have an event where we're going to walk a new initiative into the county and try to learn from those who are doing work right now. What are the gaps? And then also in Durham, we have Re-City, where we are using design thinking to empower community to come up with solutions. So they're dealing with gun violence, they're dealing with homelessness, some of the same things we're dealing with in Raleigh, but the community is coming up with the solutions. And it's raw community members. It's not an institution, it's raw community members ideating on the problem, framing the problem, coming up with solutions. And so for me, that was just what I learned in the community. People want to be empowered to engage in solutions. They want their mind to be valued. And so what I've learned, I just become that student. I'm sorry.
No. Terrance Ruth, student of the community. No, I think it's perfect.
And so when you think about kind of the next few years, the next evolution, do you see yourself being in the professorship? Or I guess really the question I'm driving at is, as a student of the community, it sounds like adoption is an issue, affordable housing is an issue. What are the biggest priorities for you to be involved in, I think is the word I want, not tackle, because I don't think you can probably single-handedly. Yeah. Though if you can, by all means, tell us what you need.
I think using that Ella Baker framework, my goal is to normalize solution creation in underrepresented communities.
Okay.
I would love for those communities to start ideating around what solutions are possible without the constraint of their condition. Many of them are in flooded areas. Many of them are in food deserts. Many of them are, we can keep going.
Yeah.
But human-centered design said those who are closest to the problem are ideally closest to the solution. And I believe in the next few years, I would love to push design thinking to those who are closest to the problem. And that means that's going to be raw grassroots community members.
Yeah, so what does that look like in practice? Just thinking about, there is some education component that often goes with that kind of work. What are the policies in place? How do you work around them? But then a lot of people who are in crisis in some way or another. And so getting the headspace, but also the time to convene that. So what does that look like?
Yeah,
it's
so
exciting.
That's a very good question. And we've been trying to tackle it in Durham at Re-City.
Okay.
So we didn't start from scratch. There's already networks of people who are loosely connected to each other addressing many of these issues. And so we started to attend their convenings. And we started a cadence of once a month where we created a community around design thinking. This October, the first Sunday in October, we're having a design experience. The last one we had was at Johnny Hatchet, the factory, when it was there. And the community is going to ideate around their problems. But we have once a month meeting, and it's a cadence. And they already coming to their housing meeting or their bike for Durham, or the room is very broad and mixed. They advocate for different things: pregnancy before birth, trees, bikes, housing, safety. The range is broad. They all come together and they just put their minds together to try to figure out how can they come up with solutions in their community. And we created a cadence of community. We have an equity statement. We have a community agreement. And now we are getting to the point where we can start designing together, co-creating together. And so to me, it's just finding the pockets that are already touching these audiences and merging this framework into their thinking. So I had a meeting with Dexter at the Southeast Raleigh YMCA, and he's looking to see how he can do that for his community. And they have a beautiful facility. They have amazing offerings. But design thinking, he thinks, could complement many of their existing programs. So it lays neatly on top of existing work rather than having to do a whole new program.
No, that makes sense. It's really cool. And it's a skill set that I think benefits people no matter where they are in their life. Right. And it's a young, old, all those kinds of things. So that's a good message to be out there teaching people. Yeah.
All right, someone wants to meet up with you to talk about solving affordable housing. They're paying, but you're picking where to go. If they say, I want to meet you for lunch in Raleigh, where are you telling them to meet you?
I have to all day, every day, say a place at the table. I have to all day, every day, say place at the table. Place at the table is a door to the city. It's the only place you can go and see all of Raleigh at one time. So I will always say a place at the table.
Great answer. All right, let's say they want to meet for a beer. I don't even know if you drink alcohol or not, but if they're meeting you for a beer, where are you taking? They want a beer, so where are you taking them?
I am a big fan of Standard's tater tots, but I do like their beer as well. Yeah. But I tater tots is first, and then we do the beer. 2 for 2 on right answers there. Well done. And no, there's no right answers. And then what about coffee? Where would you go? So I am a big Jabala. Hillsborough Street Jabala. Okay. Hillsborough. So I get my coffee down at the bottom, and then my favorite barista is Jesse. So if you see Jesse, but then I go up top to a loft, and I just do my work up there.
Oh, that's a great idea. Why have I never thought of that?
It's too many students down.
Yeah.
You have to.
Well, and they know you too
yeah.
in a different way. Yeah,
that's true.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's a great idea. And you get a little bit of an elevated view.
Yes.
You get a nice breeze.
Yes.
I only recently checked out the North Hill space.
The North Hill space is packed. They did a really good job at creating. I mean, I've never gone. Yeah. Is there a Jubala at North Hills?
Yeah.
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 I don't know where it's probably the size of this room. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's always packed.
Gotcha. Yeah, I walked in, was just kind of blown away. Like, wow, okay, this is a lot to take in before I've had any coffee.
Yes. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask. So, all of this involvement, all of this future, do you see yourself pursuing an elected community role in the future?
I try to be as responsive to community as possible.
Sure.
And it's not always that role is not always a role to be in to accomplish that. And so I haven't quite engaged that question. Even though I get asked it often, I haven't quite engaged
Familiar.
that.
You knew we were going to ask.
Well, but yeah, and I like to always say, and I believe it, there are a lot of ways to serve a city.
That's right.
A lot of ways. And sometimes not being shouted at by strangers on the internet or in person is actually kind of nice.
That's right.
You can affect change and be thanked and applauded for it.
That's right. I'm a big fan of critically thinking. To be able to argue the opposing view that you feel most comfortable. And right now in our country, I don't know if we are comfortable doing that. And but I'm a big fan of critical thinking.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for the work you're doing in our community and for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you.
I'm excited to check out all the podcast episodes. I feel like I've got to dig through a bunch now.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the time and everything you do. Thanks so much.
Not a problem.
Thanks for listening to Podcast Raleigh. Review us on your favorite podcast app. If you like this episode, share it with a friend.